He's been at Loma Linda University, of course, my employer, for the last week. And last night I attended a message that he gave, and it's a strange thing. It's a message that I have heard him preach, probably nearly verbatim on YouTube. But the problem is when I'm listening to these sermons on YouTube, I'm driving around and I'm multitasking. Last night was a very different thing because I was sitting in the congregation. The title of the sermon is The Faith, and then in parentheses it says fullness. So the faithfulness of Jesus. And he said in the beginning, and it is correct, that it produces a Copernican change in perspective. And by that he means Copernicus was the astronomer who showed that it is not the sun that revolves around the earth, but it's the earth that revolves around the sun. So a Copernican changes means the thing that is in the center has now been changed. I would honestly say that of all sermons in 30 years in Adventism, this is the most powerful sermon that I have ever sat through. Last night, I was mightily blessed. The sermon was long. I think it probably ran an hour and 5 or so. But you can go to the Loma Linda University Church website and find it, The Faithfulness of Jesus Christ. I cannot imagine a better way to spend a Sabbath afternoon, Sunday, or a Martin Luther King Monday than doing that. So that's my little advertisement. In deciding to preach on the book of Esther, something that happened just a few weeks ago produced the desire in me to preach, but it did bring back what actually was kind of a funny memory. I came into and was raised in the black church. It's where I came in, it's where I've been. I come here, I'm blessed to preach here, but Mount Rubidoux is my home church. It's Helena, Michigan, where I started as my home church. So I've been in the black church my whole life, and about 5 years ago I was back in Michigan. They had asked me to preach 2 weeks in a row, and I was preaching, and I told my wife, my Caribbean wife, I said, I'm going to preach on race relations in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, like black and white race relations. And my wife, who is not necessarily more conservative than me, but is quite a bit more cautious, she says, are you sure that's wise? And I said to her, well, I'm not sure that it's wise, but I still think it's the right thing to do. And so we got to talking, and I told her, I went to Scripture, and I found a Scripture, and I said, I'm comforted by the Scripture, and the Scripture is telling me to go forward. And she said, well, what Scripture is that? I said, Esther 4:16, if I perish, I perish. So that's my cutesy little story from Esther. The reason that I decided to preach on Esther, many of you are going to remember, this was last quarter's study, and God's mission, my mission. So I preach here on the second Sabbath of every month. On the third and the fourth Sabbath, I teach Sabbath school at Mount Rubidoux, teach in the main sanctuary. And I had an interesting happening. There's a Sabbath school superintendent, but in the sanctuary of Mount Rubidoux is a church that sits easily about 600 or 800 people. There's a number of different Sabbath schools that go on. Mine is the one that kind of like you walk through, and it's the first one that you see. So I get a lot of guests and visitors and whatnot. The gentleman who kind of runs that Sabbath school, schedules us and whatnot, his wife had knee surgery, and he had a miscommunication with me where he thought I was not there that week. He thought I was out of town. So he had scheduled someone else to teach for me. I walked in about a minute late, which is what you sometimes do when you have a 2-year-old who tends to do 2-year-old things as you're trying to get out to church. And I walked up, and there was a gentleman there. I'm 47. He's probably about 65, so about 20 years or so my senior. And he was teaching, and I thought what was happening is what I've sometimes seen, which is when I'm running a little bit late, someone will step up and fill the place so that my Sabbath school class doesn't empty by the time I arrive 2 or 3 minutes late. I thought that was what was happening. I did not realize that Herman had gotten in touch with Ken and asked Ken to teach. So I walk up, and as I'm walking up to him, I realize, he's got a bunch of notes, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, okay, I'm a little confused, because Ken never teaches in my class. And so we got to talking, he said, Herman had asked me to teach, and it was a little strange, because my mother was there, and my mother, never man spake like he speaks. That's kind of my mother's attitude with my preaching. So Ken just said, all right. He said, no problem. He said, why don't you teach? We're just not going to worry about it. And I said, okay. Well, I sat down, and I could see Ken's wife. Ken I know, his wife I really don't. And suffice to say, she had a bit of a sour look on her face. And I'm sitting there, and I I really should have deferred to Ken. Like, I'm realizing, like, I really should have deferred to Ken, but there was no way graciously to back down at that point. So I said, all right, let's move into the study. Well, long story short, as I'm kind of watching his wife, I can see her shifting from a little bit bothered that I had sort of deposed her husband. She had only shown up to see him teach. But by the end of the class, by the middle of the class, I could see that she was very engaged with it. By the end of the class, I could see that she was very excited about it. And then after the class, she actually talked to me and was very excited about going through the book of Esther in the way that we had. So I kind of said, well, if she was blessed in that way, then maybe you all would be blessed to go through the same thing. So it's taking a little bit of a different look than the author of the Quarterly did. The author of the Quarterly was fundamentally spending a little bit of time looking at cross-cultural ministry. So you have Esther, who was a Jewish young lady, her uncle/adoptive father Mordecai, who was a Jewish man, operating in the palace of the king of Persia in the capital city of Persia, Susa, and the story of the deliverance of the Jews in that context. I took kind of a more holistic view and just sort of took the book of Esther as it is and just went through the story and explained as best as I could some of the things that I think are a little bit less maybe appreciated about this book. I do want to say, as I'm stepping back what I should have said in the beginning, Pastor, very good to see you. Sister Rachel, it's been a little while. Very good to see you too. Thank you. And so one thing that I would say is this. Esther is a very familiar book. There's a VeggieTales version of Esther. And, they did the best they could to make a vegetable look attractive, to make Esther the appropriate figure for the story. But when you're looking at a book in the scripture, whether you're looking at a verse, whether you're looking at a passage, whether you're looking at a book, I think there's one central question that should be asked above all others, and that is essentially, what is the purpose of God? What is the message of God in this book? What was the message at its time, which would have been about 500 BC in this case? What was the message at its time? What is the message historically? What is the larger message that you can look at any point in time? And then finally, is there a message for us today? We Adventists often speak of present truth, but what we mean by that is, what does it say to us, probably individually, in 2024, maybe as we're entering into a new year or as we're facing new challenges as we enter into the new year? So if you want to give kind of an example, you might say, all right, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all different perspectives on the same set of stories. They're all about Jesus. But if you look at Matthew and you say, all right, what's the difference between Matthew and, say, Luke? Well, the first thing you're going to think is Matthew is a Jewish author and Luke is a Gentile author. But as you get deeper and deeper into the study, you find that Matthew is a book written by a Jew for Jews to show a Jewish Messiah who is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. Luke is a little bit different. Luke is a Gentile who's fundamentally writing to Gentiles. Theophilus is the name of the individual that he's writing to. That's a very Greek name. And he's trying to show that this Jewish Messiah is the Gentile Messiah as well. And it's very interesting. If you look, for instance, at the story of the Syrophoenician woman in Matthew chapter 15, I think it's Luke chapter 7, and you kind of get down into the nuances as to how this lady is presented. In Matthew, you can kind of see that she's so thoroughly despised by the Jews as this Syrophoenician woman. And Matthew kind of digs into that to sort of show the Jews where they're wrong. But when you get to Luke, she's presented as this mother advocating for her child and in an entirely positive light. And so Jesus' treatment of her in Luke is a little more jarring even than it is in Matthew. When you're looking at Jesus and the story of Jesus in the book of John, you're looking at a different perspective. John's purpose is to show that Jesus is the Son of God and that he is God himself. He begins right there. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. By him were all things made, and without him was not anything made that was made. That's the start. That's the point. I am, I am, I am. There's all these I am statements which hark back to Exodus. I am that I am. So when you're looking at the Bible, it's important to look at these things and say, why was this book written? Well, I think that's what I'm hoping we can do with Esther today. Sometimes familiarity breeds contempt. And not in the sense that we despise the book, but we don't appreciate it. We don't think about it. Esther is like David and Goliath, like Daniel in the lion's den. Esther is a book for children. Esther's not a book for children. The story of how Esther is chosen as queen is going to show you pretty clearly that's not a book for children. So let's talk about this a little bit, and let's say, all right, well, maybe what is Esther about? Well, for one thing, it's actually one of only 2 books in the Bible where the name of the book is a woman's name, Ruth and Esther. I would argue, I don't think that's the central point to the book. I think the zeitgeist of the time is now everyone's kind of looking at gender and role and race relations. I think that's important, but I don't think that's the central part of the book. So what I do want to say is that I think that the purpose of the book can come down to the answering of 2 questions. I'll pose the questions. The first one I'll give you an answer to and then explain at the end kind of why it matters. The second one I won't give you an answer to. You may know it or you may not. The first question is this. What about the book of Esther is completely different from every other book in the Old Testament and the New Testament? What about Esther is different? Yes? Anyone? Yes?
Jesus is never mentioned in this book.
Well, Jesus is never mentioned in really any of the Old Testament books by name, but you're getting to the same point.
You know, as far as the Son of God.
Yes. It's not just the Son of God that's not mentioned. The name of God is never mentioned. To the point where prayer is never mentioned. It says Esther fasted. It says the Jews fasted. But even the inference point to God that you would get from saying fasted and prayed, which is what we all say, we all fast. Who, as a Christian, would ever fast without praying, being a part of that endeavor? But the name of God is nowhere mentioned in the book of Esther. God is absolutely absent in terms of the name of God. But God is eminently present as far as his providences are concerned. And we'll talk about that. The other question that I have is this. Esther tells a story that basically explains to the Jews, even to this day, a particular holiday that they keep every year. So most of the holidays for the Jews, you have Pentecost and you have Passover, you have the Feast of Tabernacles, you have the Day of Atonement. These are all in the Mosaic books. These are all in the first 5 books of the Bible. They're all described there. The time and the purpose of them is described there. Purim is a holiday of the Jews which occurs in the 12th month of their calendar and commemorates the deliverance of the Jews from destruction in the Persian Empire. And it's a holiday that is explained here in Esther. Now, interestingly, what this means is that in the Jewish calendar begins with which holiday? Passover. First month. Passover. Passover is a holiday commemorating the deliverance of the Jews from certain death in Egypt. The 12th month, the end, is a holiday commemorating the deliverance of the Jews from certain death in Persia. So the beginning and the end of the Jewish holiday calendar is basically holidays about deliverance. Now, this is still celebrated to this year. March 24th and 25th of 2024 is Purim. That's the Jewish holiday, still celebrated to this day. Now, the question then becomes, all right, well, it's called Purim. Does anyone know what pur means in Hebrew? P-U-R? It's the casting of dice, or lots, as they would have called it. So, in Esther chapter 3, and we'll talk about this, it says, Haman, in plotting the destruction of the Jews, it says he cast dice, and the dice that he cast then becomes the name of the holiday that's detailing the deliverance of the Jews. And the question becomes, why is this holiday named after the dice, the lots, the game of chance that Haman played in order to begin the process of his determination to destroy the Jews? So let's move into this. What I'm going to do is we're going to read through the story. The best way to read Esther, honestly, is really in one sitting. There are some books where I don't think you can read through them in one sitting. Romans is not that much longer than Esther. You can never read through it in one sitting. You won't get anything from it. But Esther is one of these stories where In order to understand what comes at the end, you have to know what came at the beginning. And in order to make sense of what came in the beginning, you have to know what comes at the end. So I'd recommend just read the 10 chapters. It actually doesn't take that long, and you'll get the whole picture. We're going to do that this morning. We'll make a few applications. We'll get to the end. And by God's grace, we'll be able to understand a little bit more of what God is speaking to us regarding this book of Esther. So what's the setting? Well, the setting here is probably about 480 BC, ballpark. We're not really even sure who Ahasuerus is. It's probably Xerxes, but we're not 100% sure who Ahasuerus is. What's very clear, though, is that the first commandment by the Persian kings, by Cyrus, that the Jews could return to Jerusalem and begin to rebuild the city, had already gone. The last commandment, 457 BC, recorded in Ezra chapter 8, has not yet happened. So it's between that first one and the last one. But the point is this: God had provided for the Jews to return to their home, but most of them had not. Most of them had remained in the place of their captivity because they were simply more comfortable there. They did not want to uproot themselves in the area in which they had gotten to be comfortable, to put themselves in the place where God had actually called them to be. Now, what you're going to see here is that ends up having some consequences. Because while Nehemiah and Ezra are telling the story of God in Jerusalem, Esther is telling the story of God in the Persian kingdom, but at about the same time, certainly in the same period of time. So, one of the first things to notice here is that the Bible never teaches that you not being where you should be and not doing the thing that you should do means that God will abandon you. They were not where they were supposed to be. If the people had been faithful to do the thing that God called on them to do, they would have gone back. That was very clear. God had never said to them, I give to you the land of Persia. You stay in Susa. He said, I give to you the land of Canaan. He miraculously cleared the place. They had been carried away because of rebellion, and then in a continued rebellion, they stayed there. And one of the high points of the story is this: God does not abandon us when we're not where we're supposed to be. God does not abandon us when, having given us opportunity to make good choices, we, in our weakness, make the wrong choices. He simply does not abandon us. That's actually one of the starting points here. Now, one thing that's actually interesting here, and I forgot to mention this, is that the idea that God's name is not mentioned has actually made some people very uncomfortable historically. So the Apocrypha is kind of like added books in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And if you look at the apocryphal additions to the book of Esther, it's actually 6 chapters that are added to the end, which are intended to sort of provide a little context on what came before. And the first words in this so-called 11th chapter are, then Mordecai said, God has done these things. So it's like someone felt the need to add to the Bible and just make very clear that even though God's name was not mentioned by the Holy Spirit, we're going to come afterward and make sure that we clear up the Holy Spirit's dirty work. He should have been mentioned from beginning to end. So let's talk a little bit about the story here. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we can take from it. And then let's bring out what we can for the larger picture. So in Esther chapter 1, and I know that these stories are familiar, but let's go through them. Esther chapter 1, the king, Ahasuerus, begins the story, if you will, with 6 months of banqueting and party and festivity in which he is just celebrating himself, his kingdom and his power. Is this not great Babylon that I have built with the majesty of my kingdom? And that's kind of like the idea, almost like Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 on the top of his palace. Now what's interesting is if you read in verses 7 and 8 of Esther chapter 1, it says something interesting that I'll just talk to in the sense that it's just worth a note. It says, drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. And the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. This is actually interesting because in most cases, David forced Uriah to drink. And in most cases, if you're at a party hosted by a king, the drinking fundamentally is obligatory. You get the sense in Belshazzar's drunken revelry in Daniel chapter 5 that every single person was drinking because every single person was expected to drink. So Ahasuerus has some measure of wisdom in simply stating the fact, this is going to be a 6-month party. You drink or you don't drink according to your desire. Now, I will say this. Ahasuerus in this story is continually presented as a drunk pushover. Over and over again. No moral backbone, and no strength, no nothing. So he has 180 days across the 127 provinces of Persia that go from Ethiopia all the way to India. And at the end of that 180 days, he then has 7 extra days of, shall we call it, just an extreme party in the palace. And on the last day of that, it says the king was merry with wine. The king was drunk. The king was plastered. He says, get my wife over here. I want to show her off for all the other drunk men who are with me in the palace. And Vashti, who is the queen, basically said no. She was in the palace with her female attendants and her female friends. And the king said in a drunken stupor, send her over. It's almost like, Athaliah or Herod's, I can't remember the woman's name, Herod's stepdaughter, coming to dance before the people. And Vashti, in what to me can be only described as an indication of virtue on her part, said, no, not going to do it. And for that reason, she was deposed. And my point is this. God's providences can even be brought about by the demotion of good people doing the right thing. Vashti did what Vashti should have done. If the king had not been drunk, he never would have done it. It would have been to her shame to go out and show herself in that way to a room full of drunken men as the queen. And it was to the king's shame that he deposed her for doing the right thing. But I still want to point out that as far as God's providence was concerned, Vashti was not the right woman to be queen at the time and for the purpose of God. He needed Esther in that position. So Vashti is deposed. She steps down. And so the king then issues this decree, and he basically says all the men are supposed to be ruling over their houses, and then he basically steps down, and it's about 3 years later, if you can read it. It basically says in the 3rd year. And in the 3rd year, he had the party. In the 4th year, the party ends. In the 7th year, he's now got a new wife, Esther. And so it basically is like a 3-year period, and there's 12 months in which the women are kind of preparing to meet the king. So then the king basically has, it's like a beauty pageant. So he divorces his wife, he has a beauty pageant, and the girl from, it's like a Hallmark movie or a soap opera is basically what it comes across. A really bad one, actually. So when you're looking at this, that basically is what happened. Now, verse 7 of chapter 2 says that Esther was beautiful of form and face. That basically means Esther, I don't know how you say it from the pulpit, Esther was smoking. I mean, Esther was a very, very good-looking woman. And he's pulled all of the good-looking women, from the kingdom. So, now, what's interesting here, and what the Sabbath school spends some time talking about, is she kept her Jewish identity a secret. And so they're asking the question, was this the right thing to do? And I'm kind of sitting there, and I'm like, neither Esther nor Mordecai are put forward in the story as paragons of virtue from the religious sense, because she's marrying a Gentile, and they're both very clearly eating food offered to idols. So the purpose of this is not to show that this woman and this man are living as they would have lived in Jerusalem had they been in Jerusalem. But you've got two people who are possessed of great courage and great wisdom and great tact and great faith, who are living their lives in the way that they are. She was told by Mordecai to keep her Jewish roots a secret. There's no question but that when the time comes for her to reveal who she is, the wisdom of God in keeping that part a secret was very clear. And so I would look at this and I would essentially say, I fundamentally can't find any problem with it. She did not say that she was a follower of the one true God. We might struggle with that, but there's no way to frame it in this story other than that played into the things that God was doing. Now, all of that being said, Esther then goes through, and the story is a little cringeworthy. Every single one of these women goes in, spends one night with the king, and then they're put into the harem of the concubines, which basically means they and his wife, and he never sees them again, and they're never permitted to go out and be among male colleagues. Like, that's it. They can't do it. Esther somehow charms him, and he says, this is the one for me. So Esther is then chosen as queen. At the end of chapter 2, a little story is brought up. It says Mordecai, who sat in the king's gate, which means in a position of honor, maybe of influence, probably of influence, he heard 2 of the king's chamberlains, or kind of high officials, plotting to kill the king. He tells Esther, Esther tells the king, and the 2 individuals are hung for their crimes, and nothing else is mentioned. Mordecai is not rewarded, nothing else comes up. My point is this: God is never mentioned in this story, but the providences of God, the work of God behind the scenes, is the central part of the story. And in this case, what I want to point out is this: Haman hatches the plot. Haman is offended by Mordecai and makes the decision to destroy the Jews in the 3rd chapter, and God has made every provision for their deliverance before the first move is made against them. Esther has been elevated to queen, which was necessary. Mordecai had saved the king, which became necessary. You're going to see that in a few minutes. And in both cases, the providence of God, though the hand of God is not visible, you can imagine like the hand of God in Belshazzar's feast in Daniel chapter 5, it's writing on the wall. Every time that you're going through, and for instance in Nehemiah it says, the good hand of our God was upon us, the good hand of our God was upon us, the good hand of our God was upon us. And in each one of these cases individually, what you end up with here is a picture of God working in the background and behind the scenes. But the point is this: before the first need came up, before the offense was given, before Haman decided to kill Mordecai and the Jews, what you have is God having provided in providence a queen who would be able to save the people, and a man, Mordecai, who would be able to counsel the queen and be in favor with the king, all of which was necessary. Now, so what does all this mean? Most of us can look back on our lives, a lot of the time not too far back, maybe some of us right here and right now, and we can honestly say, we're in dire straits. Financially, relationally, health-wise, things are going on that have truly thrown life off the tracks. What's important to recognize in this story is before you got to the place where you are, God has made a provision to deliver you from that thing. Before you were diagnosed with cancer, God knew what was coming, and he made the provision to make sure that you would have all that you needed. Before you knew that your spouse was cheating on you, he had a provision for a future already planned out. Before you knew that there was a problem, maybe before your spouse made any decision to move in that direction. So when you look at these things, there are stories here in the scripture where if we'll figure out what they mean, we can carry them with us. It's not just about the grand scheme of God in nations. It's about God's provision for ourselves. In Esther chapter 3, Haman's promoted. The Bible doesn't say why. No indication of why he's a favorite of the king. Certainly it's not a matter of character. Nothing. It's just he's promoted. And Mordecai will not bow down to Haman. Now, you might imagine that this has something to do with him not bowing down to any mortal man. This almost certainly is not the case because he was in good stead with the king. You have to bow down to the king. Haman was referred to as an Agagite. And you may remember that one of the kings of the Amalekites was named Agag, or was a Philistine actually. But he was an Amalekite. In Exodus chapter 17, the Jews were attacked by the Amalekites when they were weak and when God had forbidden them to be attacked. And God said, I will never forget what they did, and I will wipe them from the face of the earth. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 25, at the end of Moses' life, he says, I will never forget Amalek, and I will wipe them from the face of the earth. So Mordecai is not going to bow down to an individual who is descended from the kings of the sworn enemies of Israel's God. That's what's happening. He will not do it. Well, Haman, one of the underlying themes that you find all the way throughout Esther is the power of pride to destroy contentment. Haman has been elevated as high as a human being can be elevated. He's second only to the king. Every single person in the kingdom is made to bow down to him. Everywhere he goes, everyone bows down. Everyone shows him respect. But Haman is incapable of rejoicing in the thousands who show him respect because of the one who will not. All right? You see this in professional athletes. They're out there making $40 million a year. They're the idol of thousands, millions of kids. And yet one person speaks disrespectfully to them, and they never forget it. Ever. You see it not just there, you see it in people that you work with. You see them advanced. You see things going on. Everything, they are incapable of being content. Haman is an individual who is incapable of being content because he is so filled with pride that anyone who will not worship him is the cause not just of his hatred, but his eternal discontent. Haman is a picture of Satan in this. Mordecai is a picture of Christ in this.
Amen.
Okay? Haman is a picture of Satan, a being who insists on worship at the highest level and who is offended at anyone who will not give him the, quote, respect that he deserves. Mordecai is a person who is content to serve God's people in any capacity, and advancement will come from the hand of God when it comes, if it comes. So, in a telling verse at the end of chapter 3 in verse 15, Haman has plotted to destroy not just Haman, but the entire race of the Jews. So he says, I am not just going to destroy my enemy, Mordecai. I'm going to destroy the entire race. And the dragon was wroth with the seed of the woman, with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed. Everyone who follows Jesus is going to be destroyed by Satan unless Christ specifically intercedes for their deliverance. So what you have here is, again, this same picture brought forward in Revelation, now brought forward here. Now, by the way, when you look in Prophets and Kings, Ellen White lays this stuff out all the way through. She says, this is a picture of what's happening at the end. She lays it right out. She spends very little time talking about it, but what she talks about, that's it. Now, in verse 15, it says, Haman and the king sat down to drink in the palace. It says the city of Shushan was in an uproar. So the entire city, these are neighbors and friends now consigned to death. And anyone who had any sense of justice is going to be extremely distressed. And as the word spread out in the provinces, the entire nation is in an uproar. What's the king doing? Drinking in the palace. Like I said, Ahasuerus is presented as a drunk pushover over and over and over again in this case. Now, Esther then comes to intercede in Esther chapter 4. So Esther learns she's in mourning. Mordecai comes to her, and he says something that's quite remarkable and that I think is absolutely a statement that's just full of faith. Now, Mordecai tells Esther to go to the king and find a way to intercede with the people. Esther tells Mordecai, the law of the Persians is that unless you are called into the presence of the king by the king, that is a capital offense. You will die for going before the king uncalled for. Now, by the way, this is a terrible rule, because what this means is the king is only going to hear what the king wants to hear at any given time. It all becomes an echo chamber to his own praise. He doesn't want to deal with anything. Everything about this is wrong. But Mordecai says something in verse 13. He says, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you and the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. He basically says, I know God's going to deliver us. There's no question that God's going to deliver us. The question is not whether God will deliver us. The question is, what role will you play in the work that God is doing? And that question comes to all of us. The question is not, will God close his work upon the earth? The question is, will you play the role that's been assigned to you? As he said, it may be that you have been brought to the throne for just such a time as this. When you're looking in your own life, and you're asking yourself, why am I where I am? Why are these hard things coming to me? Why have I been advanced or demoted? Why have things gone well or things gone poorly? It may be that you are in your place for just such a time as this. The question is not, do you have a work to do? The question is, will you do the work that you've been given to do? Amen. And in Esther's case, she said, and again, if you ask the question, what does God need? He needs courage. He needs faith. He needs obedience. All these things are true. Esther then steps up, and she says, go, assemble all the Jews, fast, and I would say pray, although the scripture doesn't say pray. Certainly it means fast and pray. She says, all of you pray for me for 3 days. She says, I am going to go before the king. And in a showing of rare courage, she says, look, I'm going to go. I don't think it's going to go well, because the king had not seen her for 30 days. And when you are the king's wife, and the king has put you away for 30 days, that means the king is enjoying other women. And that means she no longer is going to be viewing herself as likely to be one of the king's favorites. She views herself probably as having fallen out of favor with him for reasons not clear. She's not sure that when she goes before the king, she's going to survive it. But she says, as we said earlier, I will go before the king. And if I perish, I perish. She says, it may be that I was brought to the throne to die at this time. If that's the reason I was brought to the throne, then to die at this time is what I will do. Now, Esther goes before the king. And the king immediately looks on her with favor. This is Esther chapter 5. He holds out the scepter. She touches the scepter. She comes forward and he says something very interesting. He says, what's troubling you? So Esther comes before the king. She's been in weeping. She's crushed. Her family, her people, consigned to death. She's had 3 days of fasting. She hasn't eaten. She goes before the king, and the king looks at her and says, something is very wrong with my queen, whom he has a lot of affection for, loves her, I think. And he says, what's troubling you? And he says, I'll give you anything. He says, up into half the kingdom. Now, that's not to be taken literally. He's not going to give her half the kingdom. But that's the king's way of saying, there's nothing you request that I will not give to you. I will give you anything that you request. But she is very, very wise. And she says, my request is this. I want you and Haman to come and to have dinner with me. And at that time, I will let you know my request. And the king, he's extremely happy. She wants to have dinner with him. I'll be honest with you. My wife said to me this morning, she was like, her sister and her mother are there. So we have a 2-year-old. She'll be 3 in February. By the next time I see you, I think she'll be 3. So she says, maybe we can do dinner tonight. And I was, yes, let's find some place to put the baby, put her over here, put her over there, don't care, let's go out to dinner. Like I'm not the best father sometimes, but that's just the truth. When she said that, I was happy. I can relate to Ahasuerus. When he hasn't seen the girl in a little while, she comes up and she says, what I really want to do is have dinner with you. Oh yeah. You want to make a man happy? That's a very good way to do it. Food and attention. I won't go the rest. Okay, that's the reality, okay? So she goes and she says this. Now the king, his affection for her has just increased. Whatever it is that she wants, he's even happier now. So he sends over, and it's very funny if you read in the text. Haman is not, he says, you get ready, the queen wants to have dinner, I'll see you over there. And so Haman is going over to see the king. Now, at the banquet, the king says to Esther, he says, what is it that you want? And Esther makes a decision here that I don't think the Bible gives us enough information to understand why she does it. She says, have dinner with me again tomorrow night, again with Haman. And I will tell you then. I promise I'll let you know then. But you want to know what the danger is here? That king has proven himself to be a very self-centered person. And I would have been very worried that this fickle king, who was in a good mood on the night when you came and asked him for dinner, would have completely forgotten you by the next. That's my concern. And if the king does not ask her, how is she then going to broach the subject about the deliverance of her people? But what I would argue is this. I believe that the Holy Spirit gave her wisdom to say, there is one more step in this process, and I need you to defer until I have fulfilled all of my plan in preparing the king to receive the thing that I've given you. I believe it was just a divine inspiration to her that told her, wait a day. That night, the king, now he may have been very excited about things with his wife, and he may have just been up that night. Whatever the case was, he couldn't sleep. And so he says, bring before me the Chronicles of the Kingdom and read them to me. And people are like, it's like a bedtime story. No, it's not. I mean, come on, if you're running a kingdom, these are all the things going wrong and all the things that you have to do. This is a man working into the late hours of the night. That's basically what he's doing. There's no way he's reading that thing and not being bothered by the things that he's finding. And as the individual is reading to him, it basically says, Mordecai, these two chamberlains planning your death, delivered you. And the king says to the person who says, what did we ever do to this Mordecai? And they said, nothing. And that's the picture of Christ. He will save you. He's not asking to be put on high. He's just asking to be put in his place. He was very content to wait for God to advance. And the same way Christ is in heaven, contentedly waiting for God to advance him to the throne of universal dominion. He's still waiting. Mordecai, to me, is a wonderful picture of Christ in this story. So then, Esther is this book of reverses. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit towards the end. But it's this book of back and forth, up and down. And so Haman had been up that night before. He got out of the dinner with Esther, and out of the dinner with Esther, he sees Mordecai. Mordecai doesn't bow to him, and then even though he just had dinner with the king, just had dinner with the queen, everybody's bowing to him, everything's going great, he comes back and he's moping, and his wife Zeresh says, look, just prepare a gallows, put it in front of your yard, put it up now, and hang him tomorrow. By the way, hang, that's not what the Persians did. That's the word in the Hebrew, but that's not what it was. Do you know what they put 50 cubits high? It's a stake. The Persians killed people. They didn't hang them. They drove a stake through them and then hung them like this. It was a gruesome, horrible way to die. Hanging is a very humane way compared to that. It's a way of torturing a person. He says, put that in front of your yard. Well, Haman then goes in the next morning. He's going to ask the king for the life of Mordecai. He's already gotten the king's decree for the destruction of every Jew in the kingdom, but now, that was 11 months out, now it's only 2 months out. He's decided he wants Mordecai now. So he goes forward. The king basically says, he says, what shall I do for the one whom the king wants to honor? Haman says, who could the king want to honor other than myself? This suffusing pride. And then, at that point, he says, put the king's crown and the king's robe and the king's horse and have one of the great nobles walk before and shout, this is the one whom the king wants to honor. And he thinks it's going to happen to him. And he says, that's a great idea. So Haman, you do that to Mordecai. And Haman is just crushed. Mordecai, it says at the end, you want to know what it says Mordecai did? It says he went back to the gate. Nothing changed. Mordecai is the picture of humility, whereas Haman is the picture of pride. He goes back to the gate. Well, at this point, his wife says, if you've begun to fall in this way, your fall is assured. Next night, goes before Esther again, another great banquet, but now, Mordecai is very concerned. He's not able to enjoy it in the same way. And finally, at the end of that dinner, the king says, what do you want? And she says, all that I'm asking for is the life of my people. She said, if we were going to be thrown into slavery, I would have assumed we would eventually find another deliverance, but we are consigned for death. Everyone, myself included. And the king says, who has threatened your life? The king is furious. And she says, this guy's sitting right there next to you, Haman. And everything flips. So the king is furious. He steps outside. Haman begins begging Esther for his life, but Esther's like sitting on a couch, and Haman is begging her, probably like holding her by the legs. Esther is probably a little bit worried because she's alone with the man. The king comes back in and sees this. And then he calls in the guards. The guards wrap Haman's head up and basically put a bag over it or something like that. And so, what are we going to do with him? And one of them says, he just put a stake in his own front yard. Why don't we just stick him onto it? I'm like, okay, great, go do that. So then the stake placed to destroy Mordecai is then used to destroy Haman. The cross used to destroy Jesus Christ was the death knell of the kingdom of Satan. There is parallel after parallel after parallel after parallel in this. Amen. Now, after this, Esther goes to the king and she says, let's rescind the order. The king says, we can't rescind the order. They can't do that with the law of the Medes and the Persians. You may remember Darius wanted to rescue Daniel from the lion's den and could not do it for the same reason in Daniel, was that chapter 6. So now, he says, I'm just going to put out another one. And he says, whereas the Jews were originally consigned to death, I'm going to arm them and give them the right to gather together and to fight and to destroy all of their enemies. And then when the time finally came, that's exactly what happened. And it says, in the city of Shushan, or Susa, 500 died. And then Esther was told by Mordecai, we're not quite done yet, give us another day. And then 300 more died the next day. Throughout the kingdoms, 75,000 of the Jews' enemies died. And then you have the story at the end of Mordecai being exalted into the position that Haman had, and then Mordecai finally basically ruling over the kingdom, basically being the prime minister. So when you look at this, there's a lot of different reversals. In the beginning, in chapter 1, you have this lavish party for the king, and in chapter 10, you have a lavish party for Mordecai. You have Haman seeking the destruction of the Jews, and then Mordecai working the salvation of the Jews. And then right in the center of it, you have Haman rising up to kill Mordecai, and then Haman himself dying on the very thing that he had used to destroy Mordecai, which again is such a picture of the cross, you can't even miss it. So you look at this and you say, all right, we get to the end of it, and let's talk about this. We asked two questions in the beginning. One, why is the name of God not mentioned here, anywhere? And two, why is the name of the festival that in Esther chapter 9, Mordecai institutes to be remembered yearly on the 2 days, so basically it's a little bit of story, there are 2 days of festival. When you ask how God works in the world, it is not very often that God works as he did, for instance, in Exodus, with plagues where water turns to blood and all the frogs die and the firstborn die. And then finally he delivers the people through the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of their enemies. That's not usually the way that God works. God usually works about the way he did in Esther, behind the scenes, making providences, and using people who are willing to be used to bring about the work that he does. But the hand of God, the face of God, a lot of the time is very hard to see. That, I believe, is the reason why. In Ezra and in Nehemiah, you see the hand of God on the people, but in this case, you see the hand of God when it's in the background. And a lot of us will go through times where we will wonder whether God is with us in the thing that we're dealing with. And the answer is yes, he is. You may not be able to see him, but yes, he is. And finally, we'll just ask this question. All right, why was it that the holiday was named Purim? When Pur means the casting of the lots, it means the casting of dice. Well, Haman, in Esther chapter 3, he had been seeking the blessing of his gods by some kind of a showing for the choice of the time for the destruction of the Jews. He understood that he had to get this right. And so what he did is he cast the dice. And if you can think of it as dice, it's going to be everything from 2 to 12. He's in the first month. Now, if he got what he wanted, it would have been snake eyes. He wants them dead in the first month, he'll kill them all in the second. But that's not what he got. When he cast the dice, it was 2 6s. But he was so intent on following the leading of his gods that he might have a good omen on the thing that he was trying to do, that he said in the first month that they would all be consigned to death. It was the 13th day of the first month, on the 13th day of the 12th month. In other words, it's called Purim, because when the enemies of God sought the guidance of their gods to provide the timing for the destruction of God's people, God, in giving the answer back to them through the lots, provided 11 full months for his people to prepare for the calamity that had been planned for them. That was the first month. Haman, he died in the third month. So the Jews had 2 months of uncertainty. In that third month, they had the king give out his second decree saying they could defend themselves. Then they had 9 months to plan their own deliverance. It's called Purim because it is a way of God saying, no matter what they do, no matter how much they seek wisdom, no matter how much they seek their own good, I will work all things together for your good. Amen. So that even the things that they're seeking to destroy you will become the instruments of your deliverance. Amen. So, as we think about this book, I really do think that this is a book that has layer after layer after layer in it. I think that the picture of Christ and the picture of Satan between Haman and Mordecai is there. The advancement of Mordecai, the destruction of Haman, the fact that the instrument made for the destruction of Mordecai was used to destroy Haman is such a picture of the cross. I think that there's depth. I think that there's meaning. And I hope that we could just read this book moving forward and just to remember, it's not for the kids. It may be for the kids, but it's not just for the kids. Pray the Lord adds a blessing to the reading of his word.
Amen.